We have the tech to get food delivered in 15 minutes, but we all have horror stories about buying tickets. The Game Time app gives fans the advantage. Get amazing tickets in just a few taps. Fees are included, so what you see is what you pay. And the Game Time guarantee means authentic tickets at the best price every time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets to concerts, sports, comedy, and more with Game Time. Download the Game Time app and create an account for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply.
En Walt Disney World Resort, tu familia puede sorprenderte, como tu papá, el que siempre es callado, pero aquí lo ves riendo y gritando al ver a Mickey Mouse. O tus primos, cuando pasan de decir esa no a esa sí, cuando ven Space Mountain. Y tú puedes hacer recuerdos en el lugar más mágico del mundo con las personas más mágicas que conoces. Y eso es pura magia. Crea nuevos recuerdos hoy en DisneyWorld.com.
Hey, warmer from the low! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We're going to be joined in segment number 2 by one of our good friends, Riley Frain, who does such great work over at Mid-Major Madness, along with the Portal Report. Since he does work over at Mid-Major Madness, we're going to talk about this perhaps being a good time for a lot of these mid-major teams to be able to get up on the board, because a lot of these power conference teams are down to just filling out the roster with the final few spots. You do have a few teams that they do need a lot of work, and we're going to be talking about some of those teams as well. Looking at you, Kansas, looking at you, LSU. Ironically enough, when I recap in the final segment the news and notes that we saw in college basketball on Thursday, both teams were able to get up on the board with a transfer, so that helps them out quite a bit. But we're going to be talking about some of those teams that maybe have been a little bit slow going in the portal. What are they perhaps waiting on? Are they just whiffing in general? What do we make out of Tennessee along with Louisville, a pair of teams that have made big splashes here in the portal, but seems like they might be needing to change around their style as well, and just what we can expect here the next few weeks in terms of a lot of these signings as well. And then in the final segment, as I mentioned, we're going to recap those news and notes and the signings that we saw in college basketball on Thursday. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, and I beg of you, I plead with you, please do send these in. It is a very, very long off season. We're right now at the point where I can't quite get into conference previews yet because these rosters are so very much under construction. So do your guy a favor, help me out here and send in some of these Twitter/X questions, and you've got one or two ways we'll fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at GUNet_81. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. And if you rate this podcast 5 stars, it's very much appreciated. Them from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via the 5-star review. Why I did not get in any Twitter/X questions. It is certainly interesting to take a look at some of these teams that are trying to be able to get on the board, that are trying to be able to get just everything taken care of in general, because most of the power conference teams have been able to, but you still have a few holdouts, and it does appear as though some of these teams are going to be going the international route. But I mentioned this on the podcast about a week and a half ago prior to the start of May. Does feel like this is now the time for a lot of these mid-majors to strike. We are certainly seeing a little bit more of that, so that's a little bit of what you can expect in the final segment. Didn't really have any sort of a big splash piece of news that happened in college basketball on Thursday to lead with, but that said, we do have ourselves a great podcast, so we'll leave this intro a little bit short and just dive into it on the flip side with a great friend Riley, right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast.
En Walt Disney World Resort, tu familia te sorprende, como tu papá cuando lo ves riendo y gritando en Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. Encuentra ese momento de pura magia en Walt Disney World Resort. Visita DisneyWorld.com.
Side edge this college basketball season? Well, VSiN experts use CBB Analytics, the most comprehensive college basketball analytics platform in the world. See injury impact, on and off data, clutch time performance metrics, first versus second half splits, and so much more. Utilize the promo code of VSiN, that is VSIN, to get $30 off and find your betting edge over at CBBAnalytics.com. That is CBBAnalytics, all one word, .com. For anyone that is new to VSiN, well, I wish you a friendly hello. This is an attention to anyone that is new to VSiN because you're able to get some free stuff with our daily newsletter. It's a great way to catch up on everything that's happening in the sports betting world. It's delivered straight to your inbox every single morning. VSiN's newsletter offers picks, data, strategies for the day's betting menu, and so much more. Sign up for free today over at VSiN.com/newsletter. That's VSIN.com/newsletter, and start receiving your free newsletter tomorrow morning. That is VSIN.com/newsletter. Stay ahead of the game and bet smarter with VSiN. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Cusco Soups with myself, Greg Peters, and now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by this man, as we've got Riley Frain aboard. He does such great work over at the Portal Report, taking a look at this great sport of college basketball. He's got his finger on the pulse of something that is very, very hard to decipher. The transfer portal, it has been wild, it has been crazy, and yet he's doing a great job of being able to keep things all in line for us. I know that he's also doing an amazing job over at Major Bandits as well, holding it down in the Northeast part of the country. For Riley, you're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at very easy enough, Riley Frain, his first and last name. Last name is spelled Frain. And Riley, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. Thank you for having me. It's always great coming on here. Foremost, because you give quite the intro every time I feel like I come on the show here, just introducing me to your listeners. But, a great time talking some college basketball with you. So excited to dive into some transfer portal stuff here. You said it, it's like the Wild West, but thankfully starting to slow down a little bit. So I look forward to getting to analyze a little bit of it finally. It feels like we're just trying to track it the past couple of weeks, keep up with the hustle and bustle of it. So to get to finally, take a look at some of the players, maybe start to, dissect some of these transfer classes. It feels like the excitement never ends.
Yeah, it really does never end. With everything that has happened in college basketball over the last few years, it has truly become a 12-month out of the year sport, and it feels like the power conference teams are really trying to narrow it down, fill out those last few roster spots, and the two teams that really have struck over the last 7 days or so, it feels like that would be Tennessee along with Louisville. And first things first, how do you take a look at Louisville? Because I absolutely love what they've done here in the offseason. They bring in their Kenzie, a top 5 recruit from the class of 2027, get him to reclassify, but the way that I look at this roster is it does make me think that perhaps there might be a little bit of a, shall we say, philosophy change with regards to Louisville and what they're going to be doing, because last year they took so many threes, and with having the 7-footer in Okenzie, bringing in their Flory Benunga, it feels like they're going to be based a little bit more around the post play rather than their guard play, unlike a season ago.
Sure. And I mean, even just bringing in size in general, whether you look at their guards, maybe outside of, Jackson Shelstead, who's sort of just, a pretty average 6'1", 6'2" at the point guard position. But, him being the lead ball handler, everyone else is sort of 6'5", 6'6" plus, and, gives you potential mismatch depending on the positions. But you pointed to their front court there, but you look at Flory Bedugan and him being, one of the top, if not the top potential, transfer portal entrant this offseason. On top of that, bringing in a guy like Gabe Dynas from USC, who's 7'5", adding a guy like Varo Folgiris, from Robert Morris 2 years ago, who we know well, and of course everything he did with Iowa in the tournament this past year. And he's a little bit more of a stretch 4, but even he's 6'10" and brings a ton of size at the position. And even a guy like Carter Knox, 6'6", 6'7", incredible scoring wing, and obviously a very highly regarded prospect coming out of high school. And so yeah, definitely a ton of pedigree in this transfer class, a ton of size, everywhere up and down the board at every position, sort of outside of point guard, as I mentioned. That definitely, to your point, Greg, sort of maybe signals something of a philosophy switch. I think we're seeing that from a lot of programs. Seeing the success of Michigan and some other programs in the transfer portal and the way they've been able to transition that to on-court success and, competing for national championships eventually. So maybe we're seeing Louisville start to take some notes, in that aspect of it. But yeah, really exciting class overall. Some exciting names, guys like Deshane Montgomery, who I covered last year at Dayton, watching his rise from the MAC to the A10. Obviously with a stint at Georgia in the mix and maybe struggling there, and excited to see if he can kind of bounce back this year at Louisville in terms of his high major experience. And just a really exciting class overall. Success in the transfer portal isn't necessarily something new to him, but the way they've really dove in it this year head first with sort of a an interesting strategy in mind. Obviously bulking up in the front court certainly doesn't hurt, and I think it's going to make this Louisville team probably a little bit better than we saw last year ideally.
Yep, I think that they are going to be much better, and I do think that a lot of improvements have been made, as Riley Frain, who does such great work over at the Portal Report, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And then the other big one is Tennessee, where it feels like they're going through a philosophy change only to the opposite, because Tennessee is a team that we know that they always play rock-solid defense. They're typically based around just being able to win battles on the boards. Now they bring in Juke Harris, a 20-point-per-game scorer, Tyler Lundblade, a guy that we both love, a really good sharpshooter, out of Belmont. List goes on and on in terms of guard play that they've got. Day-Day Ames is going to be coming in. How do you take a look at Tennessee? Because while we've seen a lot of teams go a little bit bigger, they're sort of the opposite, going from a defense-oriented team that was based down low to more of a guard-oriented team that is looking like they're going to play some very exciting basketball this year.
The fact that you point all that out, Greg, is incredibly interesting because I believe it was maybe from Todd Golden a little bit earlier this offseason. There was sort of a story that came out and him talking about this shift in college basketball at the high major level, going heavy on front court play because it's so tough for mid-majors to compete in this market, the way high major players are being recruited and sort of cooed and then eventually paid by these high major teams in the transfer portal. It makes it so tough for a lot of these mid-major teams to go after some of those 6'8", 6'9", 6'10" plus guys who are close, if not borderline high major talents, just because those high major teams want to have size, if not in their starting lineup, at the very least coming off the bench, and they're willing to overpay for it. To that point, which I feel like we've definitely talked about on this show before, it's a little interesting to see Tennessee sort of go the other way. You mentioned some of the names they're bringing in, a plethora of exciting guard talent, whether it be from the high major or mid-major ranks. It speaks to, I don't want to say necessarily the philosophy that Tennessee's going with, but just maybe the way they were able to recruit specifically this year. But I also do want to point out, they are bringing in a little bit of size this year. A guy like Miles Rubin, one of the best defensive players in the A-10 last year, decent all-around offensive guy who's averaged double digits at different times, and albeit for a struggling team last year, but no doubt, I think a Tennessee team that can get a lot out of him in the front court. Bringing a guy like Braden Liu from Kennesaw State on an NCAA tournament team who was, a sufficient role player there, and I could imagine could be a decent front court piece, coming off the bench or playing some pivotal late minutes for a team like Tennessee. Brought up all the guards, but even to that point, like bringing in some guys like Juke Harris, who has some size and is probably more of a wing scorer, a guy like Jalen Harrelson, who I know is a little bit more of an on-ball guard, but even he's, 6'6", 6'7", and all of it for the most part. And of course, you mentioned Tyler Lunderblade, who is a sharpshooter at that and more of an off-ball shooting guard, but even he's 6'5", 6'6". So outside of maybe Day-Day Ames and sort of Terrence Hill, a lot of these guys that this Tennessee team bring in this offseason still offering positional size, I would say. They don't necessarily have sort of that 7-foot dominant guy in the front court like we sort of just talked about with Louisville, who probably has a pair of them, maybe joining the rotation this offseason. But still some guys who are going to be pivotal in the front court. Miles Rubin and a guy like Braden Liu, who I mentioned coming off the bench, I think could be a decent piece for them. And only providing more scoring at the guard position, Day-Day Ames, Terrence Hill, guys who are going to come off the bench. Obviously, Juke Harris and Jalen Harrelson are all going to be pivotal pieces of that. And, we touched on Tyler Lunderblade too. But, I think the way they all sort of round it out is not going to make it so dependent on the front court, but they still do have guys in the front court who, I anticipate are going to be pivotal contributors for this team. And I think that's why this Tennessee class is incredibly well-rounded. And, to your point, Greg, it was the classes that climbed the most over the past couple of weeks in terms of just the national rankings and perspective and everything like that.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that it's going to be a lot of fun to be taking a look at them in the SEC. And they're a team that has really been going the opposite of how a lot of teams have been going here thus far. And we have seen a lot of these power conference teams fill out their rosters. There are a few that are lingering out there, like feels like Kentucky is going to need a part or two. And
sure.
For LSU, they've got Mohamed Diabate as we're doing this, and they have Mohamed Diabate. That is interesting to say the least, but I always look at this time as one where the mid-majors like to strike. Obviously, we've seen a few teams like High Point have some nice ads, like Long Island being able to get the Twins from the NAIA/junior college ranks. That's big for them, but how do you take a look at this period? Because while the hoopla around the power conference teams has very much died down and a lot of these are getting set, I feel like there's a lot of guys that have gone through the cracks, and now is the time for some of these mid-majors to strike out a guy that maybe went a little bit under-recruited in the portal.
For sure. Even around conferences, I think like the A-10, off the top of my head, a lot of the Mountain West too, and different conferences like that are sort of slowing down the recruitment, not far behind them. The high major schools have sort of sorted out their rosters, or ideally have, 90% of their rosters sorted out by this point in the offseason. And so, with conferences like the A-10 sort of not lagging behind that, we're really starting to see, I think of schools in the CAA like Hofstra picking up a couple big recruits the past couple of weeks. Think of schools in the MAC like Manhattan and Fairfield and Marist making some, recruiting pushes and getting a couple commitments the past couple of weeks. So, yeah, ideally this is the time where some mid-majors are going to thrive and find a couple guys who sort of flew under the radar, and maybe even a couple of high major guys who are looking to take a step down and haven't quite found the right spot yet. So to your point, like there are still hundreds of kids at the D1 level alone, in the transfer portal. Still plenty of schools out there looking for talent, schools who don't necessarily have the NIL to compete with, the likes of teams in the Big Ten and the SEC and the Big 12. So yeah, for anyone who's sort of keeping their eyes posted and everything around the transfer portal, like definitely stay tuned to social media because like there's, a lot of big potential commitments that are going to be, made over the next couple weeks, over the next month, with some of these mid-major, low-major programs sort of, making sneaky commitments. Maybe a new coach gets picked up somewhere a little late and he's able to recruit some guys and bring them in from the portal who were maybe lingering. And so there's still a lot of talent out there. I think the big thing is we're still waiting to see, sort of what the NCAA's plan with the 5-for-5 is and how they might potentially roll that out and what that means for eligibility, because we have a lot of guys currently in the portal who don't necessarily have any eligibility at this current moment as we're recording things. So obviously that'll be a big deal because you've got tons of talented guys who, if things play out how I'm sure they're hoping, would be granted a fifth year of eligibility and thus would be eligible in the portal for recruitment. And so I'm sure we'd have plenty more high major teams diving back into the portal in that case, trying to get, a couple of last minute steals here and there. But I think the exciting thing to that is, again, like a lot of these high major rosters, if they're not already sorted out by this point, they're 90-85% of the way finished. And even if that rule were to get overturned, I think there's some interesting implications for mid-major teams who don't necessarily have rosters filled, maybe being able to sneak in and get someone a little interesting, because a lot of these high major schools didn't necessarily have scholarship opportunities to give out, probably outside of Kentucky, as you mentioned, Greg. But just a really exciting time. I know the transfer portal is closed, but it's not quite dead yet. There's still plenty of talent out there, plenty of coaches who I know are looking for guys and who we talk to at the Portal Report on a pretty regular basis, who are still looking for guys around conferences like the WCC and the Missouri Valley and the Single A MAC or the Sun Belt and different things like that. And, the Patriot League, whatever it may be. And of course, you mentioned LIU close to me at home. I'm getting a big commitment in the Twins, two former 4-stars from Chicago State who spent some time in the NAIA JUCO ranks and all that. So yeah, really exciting time to see some of these, low major, mid-major schools start to hammer out their rosters. And it's interesting, if you stay tuned to Twitter, you'll see a guy every once in a while. You're like, oh, well, that's where he ended up. And necessarily maybe a former high major player or like A10 level player who lands in an interesting spot, who you think could be dynamic potentially at that level. So it's an interesting time of year. Certainly not getting the high major breaking news storylines that we were getting, just a couple weeks back, but there's definitely lots of talent out there that's going to end up in interesting places this offseason, still to be decided. So definitely stay tuned. Lots of that going around social media right now.
Yep, there certainly is. And it's going to be very fascinating to see what is going to be happening there, as we've got Riley Frain, who does such great work over at the Portal Report, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And I think we mentioned two teams that we're very much still waiting on right now. Kentucky, because it feels like they've got great role players and no stars whatsoever. And the obvious one is LSU, because if you have eligibility, you might be recruited by LSU at this point. I still have 2 years left because I only did 2 years of college bowling, so perhaps they might be recruiting myself. So those are two teams that obviously still need to fill out the rosters. But Are there a few other teams in general that you're taking a look at right now and you're curious to see what they do? Because maybe they made some great moves, but they just still have those one or two, shall we say, pieces that they need to be able to really complete things for this offseason.
Funny you say that, Greg. For any coaches listening, someone happened to post a video of me shooting layups on Twitter the other day. Hey! So I have 4 years of eligibility left. All I did was play club soccer during my time in college. So I can't quite compete with you being a college athlete on the bowling side. But funny enough,
is bowling really athletic?
No, please. I respect it. Yeah, I mean, definitely still a couple teams out there, and it's interesting. Like you said, I'm definitely a little more mid-major focused. I can't necessarily think of off the top of my head like a ton of teams who have returning guys, especially because just in today's day and age, there aren't a ton of teams who are returning guys. But, just front of my mind, I think Kentucky's been a little quiet. Like, not to say their additions haven't been exciting, off the top of my head, bringing in Christian Reeves from Charleston, who I thought was stellar at the mid-major level, who's got some high major experience, who I think is sort of ready to take that step back up. Obviously, being 7'2" helps. Being coached by a guy like Chris Max certainly helps. They're bringing in Keanu Dawes from Utah, who maybe didn't necessarily hit his potential, in year one at Utah, but, a guy who, certainly has sort of that pedigree coming out of high school, was, I believe, a former top 100 recruit, if I'm not mistaken, and a former 4-star prospect. So a guy who, I think I see as a developmental piece that can be impactful. If I'm not mistaken, only one other transfer addition, that we have logged here at the Portal Report, that being Leroy Blyden from Toledo, a really solid point guard, defensive scrappy, 6'1", sort of right around there. Played for Toledo in a tough defensive league like the MAC. I think everyone's sort of familiar with how tough the MAC was this year, just with, the story of Miami, Ohio, and, the addition of a school like UMass and schools like Toledo and Bowling Green, who are just traditionally very just defensively stout. A guy like Leroy Blyden Jr. going to be, a solid addition for them. But outside of those three, I don't necessarily know that they have anyone else committed at the moment. I don't necessarily know who they have returning off the top of my head. So definitely a team who I think over the next couple of weeks we're going to look and see them probably bring in a couple more additions here and there. I'm sure that'll help them climb sort of the rankings over the next couple of weeks in the national radar. Be another team. I think they've done a solid job so far, but off the top of my head, Gonzaga only has 2 recruits, and I know they're sort of built off of homebrew talent. They always have a couple interesting high school guys who go on to develop under Coach View. End up being key pieces for them just throughout their consistent runs to the NCAA tournament. But only bringing in 2 guys in the portal this offseason at the moment, in Masamba Diop, who I think is pretty highly rated in the transfer portal this year. 7'1", so he's going to bring some size on the interior. Isaiah Harwell coming over from Houston, obviously competed on some nationally regarded teams over there. So obviously he's going to be a pretty impactful piece from the get-go. But, I would imagine still a Gonzaga team with some holes to fill. Like I mentioned at the start of this, every school has players to replace this offseason, whether it be guys hitting the transfer portal, graduating out of eligibility. I'm sure there are a handful of schools who are waiting to see how the 5-for-5 things and eligibility and everything plays out there. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe Gonzaga was one of them, just because, again, a team that's sort of over the past couple of years is always bringing in high school talent and developing guys within their program. But yeah, a team that I think will, again, probably have some holes to fill over the coming weeks. I'm sure there's a handful of guys out there that, they're recruiting and working with, and, if they don't already have guys visiting and on campus already. So yeah, those were 2 that are sort of scrolling through our rankings here, who I think will look to bring in a couple more guys over the next couple of weeks, over the next month or so, between Gonzaga and Kansas there.
Yep, certainly with Kansas, even though they get Stokes the number 1 recruit in the class, it has been a case where I've been a little bit underwhelmed by them. And to your point about Gonzaga, felt like they just needed a little bit more depth last season. So even if they're just bringing in some depth pieces, something that I'm looking at as well. And something I'm always looking at is your great work, my friend. Riley, you're doing a tremendous job over at the Portal Report, Mid-Major Bandits, and so much more. So love the good people at home. Know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
For sure. Absolutely, Greg. Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure coming on here talking some, whether it be transfer portal or mid-major or basketball or whatever it may be with you. It's always great getting the opportunity. So I appreciate you for having me. Yeah, for those listening, you can find me just on social media. It's typically at Riley Frain, RILEYFRAIN, as Greg mentioned. And, my coverage typically skews a little more transfer portal focused in the off season, and during the season, it's definitely a lot of mid-major stuff, a little bit of high major sprinkled in, but between stories and coverage and player analysis and different things like that, we've got it all going on at different times throughout the year. So definitely come check it out. If, any of that interests you, I'm sure I'll be back on here, in a couple of weeks talking a little bit more transfer portal stuff, if not during the season talking college basketball. So always grateful for you for having me on, Greg. And yeah, thank you.
Oh, yes, you can certainly bank on some more appearances here in the offseason, as Riley is doing such a great job looking at this wonderful game of college basketball. Every single time he joins me, makes us all a little bit smarter and has such great insight. So big thanks to Riley for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Coming up next, it is that time of the podcast. I give you a recap of the news and notes that we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours.
En Walt Disney World Resort, tu familia puede sorprenderte, como tu papá, el que siempre es callado, pero aquí lo ves riendo y gritando al ver a Mickey Mouse. O tus primos, cuando pasan de decir esa no a esa sí, cuando ven Space Mountain. Y tú puedes hacer recuerdos en el lugar más mágico del mundo con las personas más mágicas que conoces. Y eso es pura magia. Crea nuevos recuerdos hoy en disneyworld.com.
And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peters, and now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Riley Frain, who does such great work over at the Portal Report, taking a look at all that we're getting in this great sport of college basketball. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights. Did so once again today, so big thanks to Riley for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I give you a recap of the news and notes we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. Eli Tunkara, he last season was over at Arkansas State. Not a guy that was a force offensively, 4.5 points per game, but nice down low. He was able to give that team 5.5 rebounds per game. Was utilized primarily as a starter with about a block per contest. He's decided that he's going to be going to Boston College. You have to think that this is more of an insurance policy for Boston College, but I really like what Luke Murray has been able to build over here. He is the tallest guy on the roster now, but you have to think that he's probably going to be behind some of these guys like a Jacob Furphy who follows him on over from UConn. They're probably going to be going a little bit more guard heavy with bringing in Money Williams, Ernest Shelton, guys that really tore it up at the mid-major ranks. Kobe Duggan is a 6'7" combo player that when we saw him over at Campbell 2 years ago was able to take over games, and Brandon Benjamin was a double machine over at Fairfield, but still, with this Boston College team, they've had to build it pretty much via the transfer portal. I feel like they've done a pretty solid job, and I think that they are instantly going to be better. Are they going to be a team that, in my opinion, competes for like an NCAA tournament bid or anything like that? I think that that's a little bit of wishful thinking, but still, this is a team that's much improved from a season ago, and I do like the steps that they have been taking. Kazai Akenzie, hopefully I got that correct. He was over at Oregon State this last year, and as a freshman, he was relatively solid. He is from France, nearly 5 points per game, just under 2 assists per contest. He has decided that he is going to be heading to Cal State Northridge, aka CSUN, and CSUN all of a sudden is filling out a good roster. Bringing in BJ Omad, who tore it up a few seasons ago over at North Dakota, is big. Brooklyn Hicks, solid player over at Montana last season. That's nice. Makai Balu, he was nearly a 10-point per game scorer over at Portland. Now you bring in a guy who, maybe he didn't put up like tremendous numbers or anything like that, but for Akenzie, he shot 34% from 3-point range. I think that he's got quite a bit of upside here, and I do like this pickup for them. It feels like they're finding a lot of guys they're going to be able to fit their system. He seems to have some pretty active hands, is able to guard multiple positions. So for CSUN, they always want to be able to dominate the boards. I don't know if they're going to quite do that, but they typically do a nice job in terms of generating turnovers as well. They didn't do as much of that last year. I think that they're going to do much more of that this year. For New Mexico State, the offense can always be a little bit hit or miss for them. I think that they did a good job in terms of reinforcing the offensive side of things with this one. Jermaine Washington, he last season was playing over at Old St. Josie State, and he was averaging for the team about 11.5 points per game from 3-point range. Shot more than that neighbor, about 36.5%, is able to give you 3 assists per game. He has decided that he is going to be playing for the Aggies this season, and for New Mexico State, it's not like they made like big sweeping moves or anything like that, but I think that they've done a solid job in terms of mixing and matching here in the portal. You bring in Gabe Warren, who's a double-figure scorer over at Holy Cross. DJ Dudley, I liked him over at Louisiana Tech. He's from within the conference. You bring in Mark Larvinoff, who he was a 6'8" combo player, the top rebounder over at Sacramento State. So I think that New Mexico State has done a good job in terms of maintaining some solid defense, being able to improve that offense, to be able to perhaps take some strides forward out there in Conference USA. So do like what they've done, and I think that this move is a very good one for them. Flash Burton, the Flash, is heading on over to UMBC. He was averaging 15 points, about 3 assists, and a little bit over a steal per game. One thing that the Flash really didn't do a good job of was shooting it from 3 on Ryder. They were just an absolutely awful 3-point shooting team, and we do know that UMBC typically under Coach Ferry, they're a team that they do like to be able to pop it from 3, but still, I think that he's going to be able to help out this offense quite a bit. They bring in along with Austin Cross, who that's actually a relation to Scott Cross. They were both at Troy together, so I do think that with UMBC, even though they lose Ace Valentine and company, they're still going to be a rock-solid offensive team. They've been looking a lot to the non-Division I ranks to be able to bring in guys. I still think that they need a little bit more there, and for UMBC, this was a team that was a little bit lackluster down low, so they're going to need to add there, but still, out there in the America East, they were able to make the NCAA tournament last year. They probably have fallen behind the likes of a Vermont here in the offseason, but still making some nice moves. I like what they've been able to do here. For Kansas, they get up on the board. We were talking about this with our good friend Riley Frain, and they bring in Dennis Parker Jr. He began his career over at NC State, didn't really do a lot over at NC State, but he had a 53-point game last season over against Coppin State. He played for Radford, and he tore it up at Radford. 18.5 points, 6 boards, shot 37.5% from 3-point range. Now, Radford was an absolutely terrible defensive team last season, so that's going to need a little bit of work, and for Kansas, obviously, the big move for them was bringing in Tyron Stokes, the number 1 recruit in the class of 2026. I still do have to question how strong they're going to be down low this season, because when you lose a guy like a Flory Banunga, that's big. And I think Keno Dawes was about a 7 to an 8 rebound per game guy last season over at Utah, but you do have to wonder what sort of a drop-off that's going to be. That said, you do bring in Leroy Blyden, and it was solid over at Toledo last season. Again, Toledo was not a very good defensive team, though, so you've got a few question marks with this Kansas team. I think that's going to be one that might struggle a little bit out there in the Big 12, especially with Christian Reeves, who I knew he was solid at Charleston, but couldn't see minutes over at Clemson a few years ago. Now you expect him to play big minutes over for this Kansas team. Have a few question marks there, but I do think that this is a solid ad for them. Again, how is he going to be able to take that leap back up to the Big 12 level? You've got Gaspar Kocevic. He was over at Fresno State this last season. He has decided that he's going to be going to Howard. This is a good one for a Howard Bison team that they, over the last few years, have really been one of the creme de la creme teams out there in the MEAC. For Howard, they've also got James Brown coming on over from UNC, a former top 250 recruit for Coach Savard. He's not a guy that's going to rip it up or anything like that, but he was a part of a defense that was pretty solid this last season. It was a very, very small sample size, but did shoot 44% from three-point range, so you do like to be able to see that. For Howard, they do lose much of that backcourt from the season ago. They've added two bigs this far, so they're going to need to fortify that because one of their fortes was being one of the best three-point shooting defenses in all of college basketball. So we'll see how that's all able for him, but Howard gets out there on the board, and in the MEAC, being able to bring in Division I transfers, that's actually a very, very good thing for you. And for Tennessee State, they've been doing some nice things over the last few days. They bring in Aaron Bradshaw, a former top 15 recruit. DeAndre Lindsey coming over from Iona, I thought was a solid add as well. Now they bring in Christian Olsen. He was playing over at Abilene Christian. As we know with Abilene Christian, they have a defense that just has so many active hands. That's not even funny. Last year, he was giving that team right around about 4.5 to 5 points per game. Not a guy that's going to really bomb it from three-point range. Tennessee State's system just is not really based around that, but he should be able to help this team out in terms of active hands, be able to generate some turnovers. Tennessee State was really good in terms of generating turnovers, so he's going to be able to pick up the system right away. At 6'5", he's got good versatility. I think that he's going to be a nice fit in this system, and I really do think that this Tennessee State team has a chance to be able to be one of the forces out there in the Ohio Valley once again this season. Xavier Fitch, he last season was over at Wagner. He's decided that he's going to be going to UNC Greensboro. UNC Greensboro under Mike Jones, you ask who, and I say Coach Mike Jones. Typically, they're a solid defensive team. Took a massive fall off last year, bringing in a guy from Wagner that they always play rock solid defense is big, and I like his versatility. Shot 38% from three, limited due to injury, but 6.8 points, 6.2 rebounds per game. At 6'7", might be a little bit undersized for the SoCon, but I love this move for UNC Greensboro. They have looked themselves in the mirror. It feels like they're going to be able to play a little bit of better defense. They bring in Cameron Grant, who was glued to the bench last year over at Sanford, but 6'7" combo player. RJ Greer was a part of a Davidson team that shot it well from three. John Monty, he's a 6'7" combo player from Colorado, so I like these ads there. Vernon Collins, he should be able to give you something. Ante Bijan, he was over from UIC, so UNC Greensboro, they have really revamped this roster after a disappointing year last year. I think that they've done a good job in terms of being able to do so. Jalik Gaines Wyatt, he last season was over at Hampton, and he's decided that he is heading on over to Southern Miss. Solid year last year, 11.2 points, 3 assists per game. He was a part of a team that really did not shoot it from three whatsoever. And Southern Miss, you can add a three-point shooter at some point because they were really nice on the glass. They were a pretty solid defensive team, had no three-point shooting whatsoever. They've added Cameron Walls, who didn't shoot threes over at Little Rock. Marcus Overstreet, he was a very solid low-post player over at San Jose State, didn't shoot threes, and now you're bringing a guy in Gaines Wyatt, who he was solid over at Elkhorn State as well, but he shot 26.4% from three last year. Southern Miss needs to look themselves in the mirror and realize that they need to add someone that shoots from three-point range. My goodness. It's just insanity where you do the same thing over and over and you expect different results. This Southern Miss team is going to be fine defensively. They're going to be good on the glass. They're going to get after it. They need a little bit of three-point shooting, though, so we need to see them be able to come through there. Now it's Cunningham. He's going to be looking to come through for Jacksonville State. He last season appeared in 21 games, 5 points per game over at UNLV. Not a guy that's going to be like an Inferno mode scorer or anything like that, but I think that he fits the Jacksonville State system very well. Jacksonville State based around good rebounding, solid defense. He's a former top 100 recruit as well, so that is massive for them. For Jacksonville State, I just always like the system that they run. I do think that Coach Harper always does a pretty solid job over there, and for Jacksonville State, it's not like they've had a massive quantity of ads, but I do think that they've had some pretty quality ads as well. You bring in Cash Pollock, who was over at Arizona State, saw a few minutes for them. Jordan Stemke, a double-figure scorer for Loyola Maryland. Leon Horner III, I recognize he didn't light it up over at Texas Tech or anything like that, but he's a guy that was involved in that system as well. I think that these guys are all going to be able to mesh well together. I do think that Harper style of defense is going to be able to seep through, and I do think that they're in for a nice season. For USC, they get on the board with another, in my opinion, insurance policy. It's the Bruns burner, Isaac Bruns, heading on over to USC. In the 20 games that he played, his season was cut short due to injury. 20 points, 5 boards, a little bit over a seal per contest. Now, South Dakota played the Ole style of defense with him, but he's a 39% three-point shooter. It feels like USC just loves bringing in these guys that average 18 plus points per game at their previous stop, and then they use them in no form or capacity whatsoever. the next season. We've seen this time and time again, and I think that he's doomed for this, but it does give you an insurance policy. Like, they bring in Joshua Hughes from Evansville. I don't think he's going to be seeing minutes. Jalen Cox, I do think he will. He was a little bit of a do-it-all gadget guy over at Colgate. Jadis Jones, he was a good rebounder over at Lindenwood, but at 6'5", he's not going to be tall enough to be able to cut it here. I mean, you bring back Rodney Rice from a season ago. You bring back actually quite a bit of the roster from a season ago, so I give them credit. Eric Rebe is a true 7-footer. KJ Lewis is coming over from Georgetown, so they've got a lot of depth. I don't know how they're going to utilize their pieces, and Coach Musselman the last few years, he has not done the great job in terms of mixing and matching with those pieces, but they do get another insurance policy that's going to be able to help them out. Grigor Bisic, he last season was over at Bucknell. He has decided that he's going to be heading on over to Long Beach State. Not a guy that's going to give you a lot of versatility or anything like that, and he did have his season cut short due to injury last year in 18 games. He actually began his career at Toledo, by the way. 4.3 points, 4.8 rebounds per game. He's going to be able to give you a nice little post presence. He heads on over to Long Beach State. Long Beach State was actually really good on the defensive glass last season. Now, it's a Long Beach State team that really gave it up from three, and they were absolutely destroyed in terms of the turnover battle as well. So they're going to need to address backcourt a little bit more because they've done a great job down low. Noah Ammenhauser, who 2 seasons ago was a 7'2" big man, he was solid over at Coastal Carolina. Just didn't see a lot of minutes over at Oregon State last season. Johan Cisco is a 6'6" combo player coming over from Florida Atlantic. Jack Payne, the Payne train from Idaho, he should be able to make a nice move. You don't have anyone below 6'6" coming in, and I recognize that the team wants to be going with size, but I just don't know who's going to be running the point for them. That's something that they do need to address, but they're looking to be able to strengthen their strength, and they've been able to do a solid job there. Mike Williams, he was over at Seton Hall this last season. Solid player for them. 7 points, right around about a steal per contest. He has decided that he is going to be going to Tulsa. Now, Tulsa, they were based around really good three-point shooting last year, and Mike Williams is really not going to be fitting the bill. He did shoot about 34% from three-point range last year, so it's not like he was terrible with regards to his three-point shooting, but for Tulsa, they finally were able to get online last season, and I do think that they realized that maybe their defense is going to need a little bit of work, and he certainly is going to be able to help out with that. He was so versatile for Seton Hall on the defensive side. Things was an okay offensive piece. He's going to need to work on that a little bit, but Eric Conkle, we've seen the way that he's been able to just work on guys with their offense, and you got a guy like a McCone Emery coming over from Delaware at 6'8". He's able to give you some good versatility. They're going to be stronger down low with bringing in Alexa Jetrovich, who comes over from Creighton, 6'10". Chris Lufe, who is pretty solid over at Middle Tennessee as well. So I like the roster that they're building. I feel like they could maybe use one more three-point shooter because they are going to be losing a lot of those guys like David Green and company from a season ago, but Tulsa, it looks like they're going to be back to being a force once again out there in the American. And then you got Braden Eppelhans, who last season was over at Drake. He has decided that he is going to be heading on over to Xavier. Now, it is a guy that, in my opinion, is probably not going to be seeing a lot of minutes. Like, this is one where I think that this is probably like a walk-on situation with Eppelhans. He last season was able to be okay for them. Like, he was averaging about 5.3 points per contest and shot 40% from three-point range, but I don't know if you're Xavier what you're expecting here. Probably just a little bit of an insurance policy because Xavier has had a really nice offseason. They have signed a lot of guys that are frankly going to be starting in front of them. Chance Westery was a 15-plus point per game guy over at UAB. True Washington was a nice three-point shooter over at Miami. Michael Nwoko is a guy that is able to do a great job down low. He's got a little bit of versatility. Roland Salajibi was a solid defense player over at Southern Illinois. Nicholas Shatakulis is going to be able to help you out down low. Ruben Dominguez, 10-point per game scorer over at Texas A&M. So I think that this is for depth and depth only, but still, you feel good for the guy. And for Xavier, after they had a little bit of a rough time with depth last season, it is good that they were going to have much more of that this season. Chris Fields, he was over at Campbell this last season, and he was a solid player over at Campbell. 9.5 points, 7 boards, not a guy that's going to light you up from 3 at 6'7", but he has decided that he is going to be heading on over to Oakland. For Oakland, this has been a team that's been much better with regards to their low post play over the last few seasons, and it's been a little bit slow going for Oakland in terms of adding Division I players. They had that big ad in the offseason last year when they brought over the UT Arlington transfer in Brody Robinson, who really was able to carry the mail for the team. But they do have a pair of ads here now that are very solid for them. They also bring in RJ Taylor, who was over at Northern Iowa this last season, and I do think that Fields is going to do a nice job in terms of filling a need for the team because they have Bari Navarula down low, who's able to give you about 6 rebounds per game. They should have Isaac Garrett back as well, unless if he decides that he's going to transfer, because he was averaging about 7 rebounds per game, and I believe that he did indeed transfer. But Michael Hoagie, after he was dealing with injury, he was pretty rock solid down low, so they needed to be able to reinforce that because they do lose quite a few of those post presence from a season ago. He should be able to help out with that, and for Oakland now the key is finding those shall we say, non-Division I guys because they like the junior college transfers. They're able to pop it and lock it from 3-point range. And for LSU, they're getting close to having a starting five, ladies and gentlemen. Divine Okachwu, hopefully I got that correct. He was over at Michigan State. We'll go with just Divine. He was able to average about 5 points per game, about an assist and a half per contest. He heads on over to LSU. They added the international man of mystery from Brazil a day ago, and they've already got on the roster our guy Mo Diabate. And hey, I mean, again, I'll try to get this one correct. Ogachukwu, he was last season able to shoot about 44% from three in a relatively small sample size. LSU was really lacking any sort of three-point shooting whatsoever, so this is going to be able to help them out quite a bit. Will Wade, we saw what he was able to do last year over at NC State. His team was pretty solid with regards to their three-point shooting. Again, they were leaving quite a bit of something to be desired defensively, bringing over a guy that was a part of a rock-solid Michigan State program in terms of the defense. That's going to be able to help them out. Marcio Santos, coming over from Brazil, should be able to help out in terms of versatility as well. They still need to fill out this roster, but hey, at the very least, signs of things heading in the right direction there. And how about Southeast Louisiana? They've now added 4 guys over the last 48 or so hours. They get the package deal from Bryant yesterday. Now they're bringing in Tyler Rolston, which I think that this is probably the best add of the offseason thus far. Now, for Southeast Louisiana, they still are not addressing the fact that they were awful from 3-point range last season, and they look to be awful again this season. Tyler Rolston last year was shooting a nice hearty 22% from 3-point range. That said, he was averaging about 5.5 points, 2.5 assists per game, part of a team that was pretty solid with regards to their defense. So I do think that for this bunch, they're going to once again be rock solid on defense. They're going to have some active hands. They now have a guy in Rolston that's able to dole out the ball, something that was really eluding them a season ago. They really didn't have any sort of main point guard, so that helps them out. Now they just need to find a shooter to be able to help them out. We'll see if they're going to be able to get that moving forward. And we are rolling forward with taking a look at all that we're getting in college basketball right now. It is now a 12-month-a-year sport with having just so much that is happening in this great game with teams trying to be able to solidify their rosters, and I am trying to keep up with it every step of the way. If you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, whatever you for this podcast, you do have one or two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @G_81. Keep in mind, letters they mean does not matter, and per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way, that is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it's very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And big thanks once again to our guy Riley Frain of the Portal Report for joining me in the last segment, coming at you guys every single day on this podcast here in the offseason, getting you set for what is going to be an amazing 2026-27 season. And then once we get in season picks and analysis on every single game, every single day. So I appreciate tuning in today, and I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.
En Walt Disney World Resort, tu familia puede sorprenderte, como tu papá, el que siempre es callado, pero aquí lo ves riendo y gritando al ver a Mickey Mouse. O tus primos, cuando pasan de decir esa no a esa sí, cuando ven Space Mountain. Y tú puedes hacer recuerdos en el lugar más mágico del mundo con las personas más mágicas que conoces. Y eso es pura magia. Crea nuevos recuerdos hoy en DisneyWorld.com.